Hello and welcome to LongShotLarry's Sports Astrology. Today we're looking at the Australian federal election coming up on the 21st of May 2022 between Scott Morrison, who's the Prime Minister, and Anthony Albanese, the opposition leader. So we're going to be looking at these 6 charts. The start of the election, there's a solar and lunar eclipse around, all set for Canberra, Australia's capital. Going to be looking at the chart of Australia, the country, and Scott Morrison and Anthony Albanese natal and progress charts. However, they are solar data. So one change that we're going to make compared to the sporting contest is that the ascendant and ruler represents the government, not the favourite, and the descendant and ruler represents the opposition, not the underdog. At the time of filming the government, the coalition are slight underdogs around $2.50, whereas Labor, the opposition, are around $1.67. So the first chart we're going to look at is Scott Morrison, the current Prime Minister. You can see that his sun is in Taurus, and natally it's opposite Neptune and square Jupiter, which is probably his background in marketing, where that comes from. And it's also trining Pluto and Uranus, which is which are great alignments for politics, and that was active in 2019 when he won the last election. He's also got Venus here, which rules his sun. We know from our sporting studies that the planet which rules the suns is also an indication of success. Having a look at Albanese, here's a Pisces. Jupiter has been going through Pisces recently and he's had a surge in popularity. His sun is opposite Pluto. That is a hard aspect for a politician. It does mean that generally the masses are against you. You can see here Mars comes into play a bit later, is exactly sesqui his Jupiter. The progressions for Albanese, there are a couple of important ones which we're going to come to. The progressed Sun is now trine his progressed Pluto, so some alleviation, which is potentially rising to power. And we're going to have a look at this. His progressed Jupiter and Venus are in orb of trine his Mars, which comes into play a little bit later. Also of note is his Neptune, which rules his Pisces Sun, is square Saturn natally. This is a chart for Australia. It's important here that the Sun, which represents the leader in country charts, is trine Mars natally, which comes into play a little bit later. Looking at the progressions for Australia, you can see that the progress Sun and Venus are now trine Mars, which is very good for the sporting achievement, Mars for sports, but also good for the current leader, and the Sun is trine Mars natally. Also, the progressed MC is 25 Taurus, potentially. Got to take a little bit of grain of salt with ascendant and midheaven positions in Australia's chart. There's a bit of debate about the exact time that Australia came into being. Also, Neptune opposite Mercury, Jupiter natally is also going to come into play. So our first chart is the solar eclipse, which is on the 1st of May 2022. Now, solar eclipses can be in force for up to 6 months, maybe even longer if they're very powerful. This is a partial solar eclipse. The Sun and the Moon are a fair way away from the node here. It's conjunct Uranus wide. 4 degrees is quite wide, but it is sextile Mars and semi-square Neptune. How does that work with our other charts? If we look at the chart for Australia, you can see that this eclipse is exactly, or very close, within a degree of the progress Sun. So that's an indication that maybe the light is going out for the Prime Minister at the moment if his Sun is being eclipsed. It is trine Mars here. We do have Mars opposite Mars, but that is quite a close link for the Australian chart. The other thing you can see with the eclipse is that it's very closely trine the Sun, separating 25 minutes. So you have this big grand trine. Overall, you would probably say that's positive for the leader at the moment, the Sun. This Uranus conjunction here is the wild card here, whether that will mean a change in the Prime Minister or it stays the same. If you look at Scott Morrison here, you can see the eclipse is conjunct his Venus. Now, Venus rules his Taurian Sun, so it's an indication of success. Now, his Venus natally is sesquiquadrate Uranus. Now, Venus in a chart represents relations with females, particularly younger females. Uranus has been going over that Venus recently. There has been some negative publicity for Prime Minister with events to do with young females. This eclipse here is affecting him now. The point is it a positive or negative eclipse? I tend to think conjunct Uranus here does mean that this will be a change for the Prime Minister. So we're going to see how that goes. Looking at the opposition leader Anthony Albanese here, the eclipse is very closely sextile his Sun and trine Pluto, so it's an alleviation for that Sun opposite Pluto which he has. And also pretty close to his progressed Sun, which is trine progressed Pluto, so it could be a trigger for that big pattern there. So he could also be having his Sun snuffed out here. However, lining up exactly sextile his natal Sun and trine Pluto I think is probably a net positive. Concern here is Uranus is opposite his Neptune, which rules his Piscean Sun. Neptune is square Saturn, and down here you can see progressed Mars is also moving in there. So you've got a grand cross. Next chart we're going to look at is the total lunar eclipse, which is on the 16th of May, which is 5 days before the election. So here's the eclipse. The moon is in Scorpio, sun is in Taurus, pretty close to the nodes there. So we do have a total eclipse. And a couple of things you can note here. Number one, the eclipse is pretty closely square Saturn. Pretty nasty lunar eclipse, that one. Lunar eclipses tend to operate for about a month or so. And we've also got Neptune and Mars pretty close to the descendant here. And when we go and look at the election chart, we'll see that they're on the MC. Now the Neptune, I think, is more indicative of Albanese because he is a Pisces. He does have Sun trine Neptune natally. Morrison has Sun opposite Neptune. And you can see that the Sun is sextile Neptune there. The Moon is trine a little bit separating. So let's see how they line up to this chart. First one here is the chart for Australia progressed. I mentioned before that the progressed MC for Australia was 25 Taurus potentially. You can see that that Sun is on there, the eclipse is linking up with that, the Saturn square that. Also of interest is Neptune is on the MC opposite Mercury, Jupiter, which represents the media. Not sure if there's some media storm going on here, but that is interesting. If we look at Scott Morrison here, you can see that this eclipse, the moon is actually very closely conjunct his Neptune. We've talked about how his Neptune natally is opposite his Sun, so it is triggering that whole pattern. Saturn is square the Sun and Neptune here, and also opposing his Jupiter, so a grand cross. That's a challenging aspect for the next month or so. Also Neptune here is on the descendant with Mars opposing his Uranus, but it is trine his Neptune forming a wedge, so very, very active for Scott Morrison. For Albanese, the Sun is widely trine his Venus, Moon is sextile Venus. That Neptune on the descent I think is probably a bit more positive for him. It's past a conjunction to his Jupiter, but that's about it for the influence on Albanese. Now let's look at the chart for the federal election 2022, set for the time polls open in Canberra, which is 8 AM, 21st of May. The ascendant, Gemini, and its ruler Mercury will represent the incumbent Prime Minister Morrison. Sagittarius and Jupiter represents the opposition leader Albanese. So Mercury has turned retrograde during this time. It's in the 12th house. It is applying to a conjunction to the Sun here, which is void of course now. No further aspects before it moves into Gemini. Jupiter, on the other hand, is up here in the 10th house. He's in a different sign to the MC, but probably that's 1 point for Albanese. You'll notice that Mars and Neptune have moved up to be very closely conjunct the MC. They're on the descendant at the lunar eclipse. So especially Mars here, relations to Mars are going to be pretty important in figuring out who's going to win on the day. Looking at the Frawley method, the moon will also conjunct part of fortune in 12 degrees. That's probably one for the Prime Minister, one for the ascendant. And Antisca positions, we actually see Jupiter is right down here on the IC ruling the descendant. That's another one for Albanese. So looking at Scott Morrison here, we can see that Saturn is still closely square to his Neptune. Neptune is opposing the Sun and opposite Jupiter, forming that grand cross which we saw in the eclipse. The node is exactly conjunct his Sun, very close, which is usually a good thing. Whether those eclipses are going to unsettle that, we'll wait and see. How does Scott Morrison relate to Mars? Well, natally his Mars is in Gemini. It does have Jupiter applying to a sextile to Mars, which is a helpful aspect. Progress Jupiter has moved around, is now forming a square to his Mars. So that is okay, maybe a little bit optimistic. We will wait and see. And you'll also see that Neptune is opposing that Uranus, which we saw previously, and trine his Neptune. Let's have a look at Albanese. So how's this Mars Neptune fit in with him? Well, he's a Pisces, so there's some resonance to Neptune. His sun is trine Neptune natally. We've seen before that Uranus is very closely opposing Neptune here and forming a square to Saturn. Not great. So we'll have to rely on something happening with his sun to win this. Mars natally, we mentioned this earlier on, is sesquiquadrate his Jupiter. So he does have a Mars-Jupiter aspect. And we can see that progress Venus and progress Jupiter are moved into an orb of trining his natal Mars. So that looks okay. Part of fortune in the chart is conjunct his Saturn, Mercury. Conjunct Saturn is not too great. It is separating. We do see that Pluto is conjunct his South Node. Also not great. It is trine his progress Mercury. Might be some alleviation. And the final thing here is that the Mars is sextile his Venus. Now Venus potentially trine his moon. We don't know where his moon is. But that's, so maybe female voters are going to be quite prominent if Albanese wins. Okay, this Mars on the MC for Australia, you'll see that square Neptune and square Mercury Jupiter. Now, I'm not really sure what that means. Does it mean that the media is angry, or not really sure? We'll have to wait and see. Maybe there's some confusion about the result. But Venus Uranus is on the descendant, which is square Mars. Not really sure what that means. In summary, we've got this solar eclipse, lunar eclipse, and we have the chart for the election day, all to be considered. If we look at Frawley method, probably a slight edge to the opposition leader, Albanese. If we look at the chart for Australia, the main emphasis seems to be that solar eclipse on the progress sun, but it's also trine the natal sun and Mars. Potentially that lunar eclipse is on the progressed MC. They're the two main influences. If we look at Scott Morrison, that solar eclipse is on his Venus, ruling his Taurian sun. The lunar eclipse is on his sun Neptune opposition, and Saturn is square that. Now that is not good. And if we look at election day, he has Mars semi-square his Venus, which rules his sun. Jupiter is sextile his Mars, so there is hope on election day. Anthony Albanese, the solar eclipse is sextile his sun, trine his Pluto, which I think is pretty helpful. He does have that Uranus opposite his Neptune, which rules his sun, which is not helpful. The lunar eclipse, that Neptune on the descendant, I think resonates to his Pisces sun, and that Neptune on election day is also on the MC, which I think resonates to his Pisces sun. He has better links to Mars, in my opinion. It is sextile his Venus, and he's got those progressions to his natal Mars. So, in summary, I think the effect of these eclipses before the election is key. If you look at some of the literature, they have been known to block the light of the leader. So based on those eclipses and everything I've been through, I think Anthony Albanese is favoured to win by the stars. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.